Steve Harvey had occupied the host position at Family Feud for over 14 years, during which time he had encountered thousands of contestants, representing every conceivable background and life experience. His ability to read people had been refined through decades in entertainment, allowing him to sense when contestants carried secrets, harbored anxieties, or possessed stories that extended far beyond the cheerful exterior they presented for television. On this particular Thursday afternoon, in March 2025, as he prepared to welcome two competing families onto the stage, Steve experienced that familiar intuition suggesting the episode would deviate significantly from standard programming. What would unfold over the subsequent hour would become one of the most controversial and psychologically complex moments in game show history, forcing everyone present to confront difficult questions about redemption, justice, and whether people who have committed terrible acts deserve second chances. Before examining this extraordinarily complicated story about past crimes, present consequences, and the impossibly difficult question of whether someone can truly atone for inexcusable actions, if you believe these conversations matter because they force us to examine our assumptions about forgiveness and accountability, please activate the like function and subscribe to our channel to ensure you receive future content exploring the moral complexities that define human experience. The Harrison family from Denver, Colorado had arrived at the studio for their scheduled Family Feud appearance, led by 43-year-old Michael Harrison. Michael presented as a composed professional whose demeanor suggested competence and reliability. He had introduced himself during pre-show interviews as a successful addiction counselor who specialized in helping formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society, work that he described with obvious passion and commitment. Standing beside Michael were his wife Jennifer, their two teenage sons, and his younger sister Amanda. The family unit appeared cohesive and supportive, demonstrating the kind of genuine affection that translated well to television and made audiences invest emotionally in their success. What remained unknown to everyone in the studio, what Michael had deliberately omitted from his application materials and preliminary conversations with production staff, was that his expertise in addiction counseling and criminal rehabilitation derived from intensely personal experience that would shock viewers and force Steve Harvey to confront moral questions he had never anticipated addressing on a game show. Michael Harrison had not always been the respectable professional standing on that stage. 20 years earlier, at 23 years old, Michael had been a different person entirely, someone whose choices had resulted in consequences so severe and irreversible that describing them required confronting the darkest possibilities of human behavior. Michael had struggled with severe addiction to methamphetamine throughout his late teens and early 20s, a dependency that had progressively destroyed his judgment, his relationships, and ultimately his capacity to distinguish right from catastrophically wrong. The addiction had been fueled initially by trauma from childhood abuse, then sustained by the powerful grip of chemical dependency that overrode every other consideration, including basic morality and human decency. During the worst period of his addiction, Michael had committed crimes ranging from theft to assault, accumulating arrests and brief jail sentences that did nothing to address the underlying addiction driving his destructive behavior. The crime that had finally resulted in serious consequences had occurred on a winter night when Michael, desperate for money to purchase drugs and completely divorced from rational thinking, had broken into what he believed was an unoccupied house in a wealthy neighborhood. His plan had been simple theft, taking valuables he could quickly convert to cash. What Michael had not known, what his impaired judgment and inadequate planning had failed to account for, was that the house was occupied by an elderly couple who had retired early that evening. When the homeowner, a 72-year-old man named Richard Chen, had confronted Michael in the hallway, Michael had panicked. In the chaotic moments that followed, a physical altercation had ensued during which Michael had struck Mr. Chen repeatedly with a heavy flashlight he had been carrying, inflicting severe head trauma that would have lasting consequences. Mr. Chen had survived the attack, but had sustained permanent brain damage that affected his cognitive function, his mobility, and his quality of life for the remainder of his years. His wife Alina had discovered him unconscious and bleeding, called emergency services, and provided descriptions that had led to Michael's arrest within 48 hours. The evidence against Michael had been overwhelming, including his fingerprints at the scene, items from the Chen home discovered in his possession, and eventually his own confession once he had been detained long enough for the methamphetamine to clear his system and the horror of his actions to become apparent. Michael had been charged with aggravated burglary and assault with intent to cause great bodily harm, crimes that carried potential sentences of decades in prison. The legal proceedings had been extensive and painful. Michael's public defender had argued that his client's severe addiction constituted a mitigating factor, that Michael required treatment rather than purely punitive incarceration, and that he had expressed genuine remorse for his actions. The prosecution had countered that Michael's crime had been violent and had permanently damaged an innocent elderly man who had simply been defending his home, that addiction did not excuse such behavior, and that public safety required substantial imprisonment. Mr. and Mrs. Chen had attended the sentencing hearing, with Mrs. Chen delivering a victim impact statement describing the devastating effects of the attack on her husband's health and their family's sense of security. She had spoken about her husband's diminished cognitive capacity, his inability to care for himself independently, and the fear that now permeated their existence after decades of feeling safe in their own home. The judge had sentenced Michael to 18 years in state prison, a substantial term that reflected the seriousness of the offense, while acknowledging his lack of prior violent convictions and his addiction-related diminished capacity. Michael had been transferred to a medium-security correctional facility where he would spend nearly 2 decades of his life. The early years of his incarceration had been extraordinarily difficult as Michael confronted the reality of what he had done to Mr. Chen and processed the shame, guilt, and self-loathing that accompanied that awareness. He had experienced severe depression and had contemplated suicide multiple times, believing that he was fundamentally irredeemable and that the world would be better without him. The transformation that eventually occurred had begun when Michael was assigned to work in the prison library, a position that gave him access to books about psychology, addiction, trauma, and rehabilitation. He had begun reading extensively, trying to understand the factors that had led to his addiction and violent behavior, and gradually developing a framework for comprehending how trauma, untreated mental health issues, and substance dependency had created a cascade of poor decisions culminating in irreversible harm to an innocent person. Michael had enrolled in every educational and therapeutic program the prison offered, earning his GED, completing substance abuse treatment, participating in violence prevention groups, and eventually taking college courses through a prison education initiative that partnered with a local university. During his 10th year of incarceration, Michael had written a letter to Mr. and Mrs. Chen, a difficult and emotionally wrenching process that had required him to articulate his remorse, acknowledge the harm he had caused, and ask for nothing in return except the opportunity to express his profound regret. He had not expected a response and had been shocked when Mrs. Chen had written back several months later. Her letter had been direct and honest, explaining that while she could not forgive him for what he had done to her husband, she appreciated his willingness to take responsibility and his apparent efforts at rehabilitation. She had described her husband's continued struggles with the lasting effects of the brain injury, making clear that Michael's crime had permanently altered their lives in ways that could never be repaired or compensated. That letter had affected Michael profoundly, forcing him to confront the permanent nature of the harm he had caused, and the reality that no amount of personal growth or rehabilitation could undo what he had done to Mr. Chen. Rather than leading to despair, however, the correspondence had crystallized Michael's determination to use whatever remained of his life to create some measure of positive impact that might partially offset the terrible harm he had inflicted. He had decided to pursue education in addiction counseling and criminal rehabilitation, fields where his personal experience could potentially help others avoid the destructive path he had followed. Michael had earned a bachelor's degree in psychology through the prison education program, graduating with honors and demonstrating academic capabilities that had been completely dormant during his drug-addicted youth. He had also become a peer counselor within the prison, working with other inmates struggling with addiction and helping facilitate rehabilitation programs. The prison staff had recognized Michael's transformation and had written letters supporting his eventual parole application, noting that he represented the kind of genuine rehabilitation that the correctional system aspired to achieve but rarely witnessed. After serving 16 years of his 18-year sentence, Michael had been granted parole based on his exemplary conduct, his educational achievements, his completion of every available rehabilitation program, and the assessment that he posed minimal risk of reoffending. His release had been contingent upon strict conditions, including continued counseling, regular meetings with his parole officer, maintenance of employment, and absolute abstinence from drugs and alcohol verified through random testing. Michael had been 39 years old when he walked out of prison, carrying a bachelor's degree, 16 years of hard-won sobriety, and a commitment to dedicating his remaining years to helping others avoid the mistakes that had cost him so much and had inflicted such terrible harm on Richard Chen. Reintegrating into society had been extraordinarily challenging despite Michael's education and determination. His felony conviction created barriers to employment, housing, and social acceptance that made every aspect of rebuilding his life difficult. He had worked initially in minimum wage positions while applying to graduate programs in counseling psychology, facing rejection after rejection from schools that were unwilling to admit someone with his criminal history, despite his academic credentials and obvious rehabilitation. Finally, a small private university that specialized in training addiction counselors had accepted him into their program after reviewing his complete file and conducting extensive interviews to assess his character and commitment. Michael had completed his master's degree in addiction counseling while working full-time and meeting the requirements of his parole. During this period, he had met Jennifer, a social worker who had initially been assigned to help him navigate reentry services, but who had recognized something genuine in Michael's commitment to rehabilitation and his desire to help others. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, with Michael being completely transparent about his past from their first conversation. Jennifer had seen not the violent criminal Michael had been at 23, but the transformed individual he had become through years of difficult personal work, and she had eventually agreed to build a life with him. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been Jennifer's idea, proposed during a conversation about creating positive family memories and demonstrating to their sons that people could overcome terrible mistakes and build meaningful lives. Michael had been extremely hesitant, aware that national television exposure carried risks, including the possibility that someone would investigate his background and expose his criminal history. Jennifer had argued that Michael had nothing to be ashamed of regarding his current life, that his work helping others was honorable and important, and that hiding his past indefinitely meant living in constant fear of exposure. Michael had eventually agreed to apply, reasoning that the statistical likelihood of being selected was minimal, and that if selected, he would simply participate as a contestant without volunteering information about his criminal history unless directly asked. As Steve Harvey initiated the game with his characteristic energy and humor, the Harrison family performed competently. Michael answered questions with intelligence and demonstrated the quick thinking that had served him well in his counseling work. Steve observed that Michael carried himself with unusual gravity for a game show contestant, a seriousness that suggested depth of character and life experience beyond typical Family Feud participants. During a commercial break, Steve engaged Michael in conversation, asking about his work as an addiction counselor and expressing admiration for people who dedicated themselves to helping others overcome substance dependency. Michael responded with genuine passion about his work, describing the privilege of supporting people through recovery and the satisfaction of witnessing transformation in individuals whom society had often written off as beyond redemption. The moment that irrevocably changed the trajectory of the episode occurred during the fourth round when the question appeared asking contestants to name something people are afraid others will discover about them. Michael buzzed in first and answered with immediate certainty, stating a criminal past. The response registered as the number 2 answer on the board, and the audience applauded routinely. Steve paused, however, noting the specific and unqualified way Michael had delivered the answer, the slight tension in his voice, and the way he had avoided eye contact immediately after speaking. Steve's extensive experience reading people triggered an instinct that Michael's answer had derived from personal knowledge rather than general speculation. Without fully considering the implications, Steve asked a question that seemed innocuous, but that would prove catalytic. He looked at Michael and asked casually whether he had answered from personal experience or whether he was simply guessing what might appear on the survey. The studio fell silent as everyone waited to see how Michael would respond. Michael stood completely still for a prolonged moment, visibly wrestling with whether to deflect the question or to honor the commitment to honesty that had defined his life since leaving prison. Finally, he looked directly at Steve and made a decision that would transform everything. He stated simply that yes, he had answered from personal experience, that he had a criminal past that he had spent 20 years trying to atone for, and that he carried fear every day that his past would destroy the life he had built. Steve's expression shifted from curious to shocked as he processed Michael's admission. He set his cards on the podium and took a step toward Michael, his professional demeanor giving way to genuine concern and confusion about how to proceed. The production team immediately recognized that something significant was unfolding and made the decision to pause taping to assess the situation. During the break, Steve spoke privately with Michael, asking him to explain what he meant by criminal past and to describe the circumstances that he feared might be exposed. Michael made the decision to tell the complete truth, describing the methamphetamine addiction, the home invasion, the violent assault on Richard Chen, the 18-year sentence, and the 16 years he had served before being paroled. Steve Harvey listened to Michael's confession with an expression that shifted between shock, concern, and visible struggle to process information that challenged every assumption about the pleasant family man who had been playing the game moments earlier. When Michael finished speaking, Steve stood silent for a considerable time before finally asking the question that everyone would eventually want answered. He asked Michael directly whether Mr. Chen had survived the attack and what permanent damage Michael's actions had caused. Michael answered honestly, describing the severe brain injury, the permanent cognitive impairment, the lasting effects on Mr. Chen's quality of life, and the knowledge that his actions had inflicted irreversible harm on an innocent person who had simply been defending his home. The decision about how to proceed fell ultimately to Steve, who recognized that continuing the game as if nothing had been revealed would be dishonest, while exposing Michael's past on national television raised serious ethical questions about redemption, privacy, and whether someone who had served their sentence deserved to have their criminal history broadcast to millions of viewers. Steve made a choice that reflected both his moral convictions and his understanding of the complicated nature of human transformation. He decided that the conversation needed to happen, that Michael's story raised important questions about crime, punishment, addiction, and rehabilitation that audiences needed to confront, but that it needed to be handled with care and seriousness rather than as entertainment or scandal. When taping resumed, Steve addressed the audience and the cameras directly, explaining that something had emerged during the commercial break that required addressing before the game could continue. He invited Michael to stand at the podium and asked if he was willing to discuss his criminal past openly and honestly with full understanding that millions of people would eventually see the conversation. Michael agreed, stating that he had lived in fear of exposure for years and that perhaps the time had come to stop hiding and to trust that his actions over the past 2 decades spoke loudly enough to be heard alongside the terrible crime he had committed at 23. What followed was one of the most morally complex and emotionally difficult conversations ever broadcast on a game show. Michael described his addiction, his crime, his victim, his sentence, and his 16 years in prison with unflinching honesty that made clear he took full responsibility for his actions and made no excuses based on addiction or trauma. He spoke about Richard Chen by name, describing the permanent harm he had inflicted and acknowledging that no amount of rehabilitation or positive work could ever undo what he had done to an innocent elderly man. He explained his transformation not as redemption, because he believed some acts could not be redeemed, but as an ongoing effort to create some measure of positive impact that might partially offset the terrible harm he had caused. Steve asked difficult questions that reflected the moral complexity of the situation. He asked Michael whether he believed he deserved a second chance after committing such a violent crime. He asked whether Michael thought his victim's family could or should forgive him. He asked whether Michael's current good work erased or diminished the harm he had caused 20 years earlier. Michael answered each question with painful honesty, stating that he did not know whether he deserved a second chance, but that he was trying to earn one through his actions, that he had no expectation of forgiveness from the Chen family and would not presume to ask for it, and that nothing he did could erase the harm he had caused, but that he was obligated to try to prevent others from following his destructive path. The audience reaction was deeply divided and viscerally intense. Some viewers expressed compassion for Michael's transformation and supported the idea that people who had genuinely rehabilitated themselves deserved opportunities to contribute to society. Others expressed outrage that someone who had committed such a violent crime was being given a platform on national television, arguing that certain acts forfeit one's right to redemption and that Michael's victim deserved consideration above Michael's rehabilitation. The conversation extended far beyond the studio as the episode aired weeks later, generating intense debate about criminal justice, addiction, rehabilitation, and whether society should embrace or reject people who have served their sentences and demonstrated genuine transformation. If this story has challenged your thinking about crime, punishment, and redemption, if it has forced you to examine your beliefs about whether people can truly change after committing terrible acts, please engage with this content by activating the like function and subscribing to our channel. Share this with individuals who need to confront the reality that moral questions rarely have simple answers, and that human beings contain capacity for both terrible harm and genuine transformation. The story of Michael Harrison compels us to ask whether serving one's sentence satisfies the debt owed to society, whether transformation matters more than past actions, and whether we as a society benefit more from permanent condemnation or from allowing rehabilitated individuals to contribute positively to the world despite their irredeemable pasts.